chance to talk to you today about fundraising, and in particular about funding strategies and management. Rather than give you a how-to, which is what Niall did very early on, what I'm going to do is just take a few of our projects and talk more generally about the ways in which we've fundraised for those projects, because some of them are slightly more unusual and it might give you a bit more inspiration for some of your own projects and other ways of looking at it. And I'm trying not to think inside the box, because it's much easier to think outside the box in terms of fundraising. First of all, I should just say a little bit about who we are. Scottish Historic Buildings Trust is a building preservation trust, and we have over 35 years experience in rescuing derelict and redundant buildings throughout Scotland. We celebrated our 35th anniversary last year, and over that time we've saved over 30 significant buildings in Scotland, and they're usually category A listed buildings. They're usually also within the hearts of communities, and in order to do that we've raised over £25 million. So we've been around a wee while. We kind of think we know what we're doing sometimes, but not all the time. But every project is unique, and every project will throw something at you that you've never experienced before. Firstly, I think I need to stress that although we're a charity and we're dedicated to the conservation and promotion of Scotland's architectural heritage, we can only do it by delivering lively and viable sustainable new uses for those historic buildings whose survival is threatened by disuse, dereliction or demolition, as you can see in this slide here. But when we succeed, and this is becoming more important recently, we can also contribute to government's national outcomes. For those of you who are Scottish and working with Historic Scotland, these are the boxes now you have to tick. So we remove buildings from the Buildings at Risk Register, because all of our buildings are on it. We regenerate communities and we enhance the built environment. By development and training of craft skills, we also add to the training of the country. We also raise awareness of the educational value of the historic environment. And finally, we contribute to the local economies by providing employment during construction as well as when the buildings are complete. And quite often, these buildings are in the hearts of the communities, so it also has a direct impact, the fact that they're derelict and redundant, on the communities that they surround. So I'll just run through a few projects with you today. And I'm going to start by just talking about two projects in Bowness, which, for those of you who aren't remember, heading through to Fife, left before the bridge. And I've raised Dimmicks Buildings in Bowness. Prior to taking up my role here with SHBT, I was head of buildings with the National Trust for Scotland, and they have their own building preservation trust department. And this is where I first became involved in Bowness. The Dimmicks building shown here occupies a prominent site in the heart of Bowness and dates back to 1650. When the NTS were asked to look at it, we considered a number of uses, and the final scheme that we came up with saw the building being converted into much needed amenity housing for the elderly in Bowness. And amenity housing is housing for people who want to move out of their own home but don't need shelter housing. It's that bit in the middle, and they have quite strict criteria for them. And that allowed us to work in partnership with the Castle Rock Housing Association. They helped us with the brief. We worked on the outside and the external restoration. But the significance of that partnership allowed the NTS at the time to lever in funding from Castle Rock from their housing pot. And that was quite important for Dimmicks Buildings, because it allowed us to work with Historic Scotland, the Heritage Lottery and other trusts and foundations that supported the trust's work, but to bring quite an important pot of money in, but also a really important and sustainable end use. And Castle Rock took title to that building when we finished. The reason why I mentioned Dimmicks is that it leads quite nicely onto my next project, because on the back of opening Dimmicks in May 2004, as you can see by Prince Charles, the critical thing of that opening is he also launched the start of the Townscape Heritage Initiative scheme, and that was critical to our next project. And the THI scheme is a partnership between Falkirk Council, who's the local authority, the Heritage Lottery Fund and Historic Scotland. And it allowed us to build on the earlier project at Dimmicks and give a boost to Falkirk Council's plans for economic regeneration in Bowness. There are quite a lot of important buildings within the heart of Bowness. Dimmicks was one of them. And Bowness is interesting. Whilst a lot of town centres in West Lothian in the 60s had quite a lot of demolitions and rebuilding, Bowness retained quite a lot of its original buildings. So there was a heart that actually could be redeveloped through the THI. With SHBT, we took over the Hippodrome Cinema, and the Hippodrome Cinema was built in 1911 and is the earliest purpose-built cinema in Scotland, so it's quite an important building. As with all of the buildings that we deal with, the Hippodrome had fallen into decline for a number of years. For 20 years it had been a bingo hall, which most cinemas in Scotland have ended up at some point in their life, and then for a further 20 years it was derelict. And a mistake at the time, we actually owned the building for 20 years as well, so that's not something we've done again. But with the funding from the THI and the other funders, we were able to save this building and, interestingly enough, restore it to its original use as a cinema, even though we considered all sorts of options. Because we had the backing of Falkirk Council, now Falkirk Community Trust, we were able to restore it as a cinema. We now lease it to Falkirk Community Trust and they run it as a cinema, and it's just been awarded an award for Best Independent Cinema. And if you're into silent film festivals, every May they have a silent film festival, which is fantastic and sold out very quickly. But I think it's interesting about these two projects because both buildings have acted as the catalyst to regeneration, and that was quite important. And Bowness now is transformed from the days that we started in Dimmock. You can actually, there is a restaurant in Bowness now where you can eat before you go to the When we started in Dimmock, you couldn't even get a cup of coffee. So yeah, two buildings acting as a catalyst for regeneration, two building preservation trusts acting as the catalyst for regeneration by going in and being the pioneering developer, as it were, allowing other commercial developers to take on some of the less complicated buildings as part of what they do. Where the Hippodrome's interesting to the Trust as an organisation is it was a turning point in the way that we worked. In the past we used to be a revolving fund BPT, which Niall mentioned, and that worked quite well because a lot of our earlier projects were generally smaller, they were generally converted into residential dwellings, and we operated as the revolving fund BPT. This meant, ideally, that we could use the funding from previous projects to prime fund the next project to match funding from local authorities in Historic Scotland. And occasionally we achieved a surplus, which was fantastic, and that's all we invested. The Hippodrome brought a change in our approach for the Trust because it was our intention to retain ownership upon completion. And as Niall mentioned earlier, that meant that we had to raise 100% of the funding. Whereas in the past we could prime it with the revolving fund, now we actually had to take a project and raise all the money that was required for the capital project. So for us as an organisation, we entered a new era of complex funding arrangements for each project. And for those of you who've done it before, it required delicate balancing and juggling of funders' priorities. None of them work together. Their requirements and their timetables. In addition to dealing with more complex buildings and their uses, and again, we've moved from smaller domestic into much more complicated buildings as we've moved through our own development. But every single project that we do has to be developed and delivered to the required standard, the required budget and the required programme. So it is quite a challenge doing it. But I think a key component of the success of both of the projects in Bowness was the support of the local authority, and that, on reflection, has helped a lot of our projects succeed. And where you don't have that support, it makes life much more difficult. With Bowness, the key difference that the local authority made is that they instigated the THI scheme. We worked with them through the very early stages, so the Hippodrome was a key, it wasn't just a priority building within the scheme, it was a key priority building, and it secured quite a bit of funding. The funding from the THI scheme allowed us to develop the project, but again, Falkirk Council stepped in and gave us funding to take us up to tender stage that we could pay back through the grant for the THI scheme, because as you know, funders usually only give money when you're on site, and the hard bit is the development bit in the middle. But again, Falkirk Council stepped in, helped us with the development phase, and we just paid the money back, and that was an interest-free loan. They also worked with us to look at the options, and it was them that stepped in to say Bowness could do with the cinema. So again, working with us as the end user, we rent the building to them now. It's a modest rent, but it's a commercial rent for a cinema because it's a restricted use, and it's now a thriving cinema. It took them a few years, but it's now a thriving cinema. But I think equally more important, Falkirk had the full support of all its elected members, and you can't forget how important that is in succeeding. And I think, again, the council worked with us to help push through the barriers and find solutions, not put the barriers up in our way. So that's been quite important for projects that we've developed successfully over the last few years. Another project that couldn't have happened without the support of the local authority is Greenlaw Town Hall and Scottish Borders. It's an 1831 building by John Cunningham, and it served as a courthouse of Greenlaw, which was the county town of Berkshire, until it moved to Duns. It's an iconic building plonked in the middle of the village green. It's a very English pattern with the houses round the village green. And because it had been derelict, it was absolutely detrimental to the property values of the community living around the green. So it was a pretty sorry state. We became involved on the introduction by the local authority. It'd been owned by a local trust for over 10 years, and they'd struggled to find a way forward and a viable scheme for this building. And we were asked to become involved when they'd given up hope and they were trying to hand the keys back to the council. And the council were saying, we don't want these keys, it's not our building, it's yours. So they came to us to see if we could help. But again, when they came to us, they came with an understanding that they had to work with us because they'd asked us to help, so they had to help us help them, as it were. And they started by just hosting a meeting with the Lottery and Historic Scotland round the table to talk about this building as a problem. Scottish Borders Council have their own buildings at risk register, so Greenlaw was the top priority on that register. So they were able to sit down with Historic Scotland and Lottery and say, this is a priority building for us, we have to find a way forward, and we all have to find that way forward, because if we don't succeed, it will come back somewhere along the line to one of you. And it did, because the trust that owned it very cleverly threatened to put in an application for demolition. So that got everybody's attention, because at some point then Historic Scotland would have to make a decision as to whether that building could be demolished. So there are ways of achieving your goals nicely, but the outcome of those early discussions where we managed to save Greenlaw Town Hall. But where the council was important is it stood side by side with us, with the local community of 600 people who were absolutely divided about this building. But the council stood with us at the public meetings and basically laid it on the line to them. And we managed to buy in enough support from the local community to move forward. We got our, the Architectural Heritage Fund gave us their maximum project development grant. Now, token gesture in the scale of things, but it allowed us to keep going. And that was very important for us. We also got the total conservation budget from the Scottish Borders Council, which was £35,000. A meagre amount of money, but it was all the money they had, and they put it on the table. And that was actually quite powerful, because they could have said, we have no money. And they did, but they said, but here's what we've got. And again, it's quite powerful, a small pot of money, but very powerful in the whole funding package for that project. We also were very lucky with Greenlaw that a charitable trust gave us £30,000 just to make the building wind and watertight. And what a difference that made. It allowed us just to get the building wind and watertight, empty all the debris, we had no roofs on the pavilions, and allow it to start drying out. And that little bit of money again made a big difference because it saved money down the line. We got the maximum grant for Historic Scotland, which was kind of taken as read because they were sitting around the table with us. But where this project might be interesting for you in the future, whether it's enabling development or how you call it, is a local landowner offered to give us some land. And we were able to sell that land to a local housing association. And they were able to build 16 affordable houses on that piece of land. So not only were we able to save an important building, but we were also able to create some affordable housing in Greenlaw, which is much needed. But where the council were very important in this setup is we did it via Section 75 agreement. The local authority structure plan had to be changed because where they wanted to develop was the other end of the village, not where the owner was giving us the land. They changed the structure plan. We had a very helpful deadline that was set by Historic Scotland to raise 25% of the money within 3 months, and we couldn't have done it without the local authority pushing through the planning permission for this plot of land, because it was only on receipt of planning consent that the housing association could give us the money. Very complicated, but we achieved the end result. We were also very lucky on Greenlaw that a new funding stream from ERDF came on stream at the same time, so we just went straight for that. But with Greenlaw, we also raised substantial sums of money from trusts and foundations, as well as local landowners and the general public for the village of Greenlaw. And Greenlaw, again for us, Greenlaw was a first. We've moved from BPT into trying to raise all the funds from the project. Greenlaw was our first step into merchandising and all the things that go with fundraising. So we had t-shirts, bags, pens, Christmas cards, all that kind of thing. We did sponsorship. We had people sponsoring a stone on the building. We did fundraising events. We had Mary's Music School coming down and giving a concert in the church, and then another house owner offered to put everybody up for dinner to raise money, as well as attending the village fair every year and shaking the tin can. And, you know, we did everything to raise money for Greenlaw, but without the support of the local authority, we wouldn't have been able to keep going. It was hard going, but we got there. I think the two projects show that the Hippodrome and Greenlaw were both £1.8 million. The Hippodrome had about 5 funders on it, and you can see the slide on the left, just crudely the proportion of funders and where the money was coming. Greenlaw had about 45 significant funders on it. And Greenlaw kind of shows us the climate that we are now operating within. Nowadays, you can't just have 5 funders and that's it. And we're in this plethora of funding coming from all streams, because that's the way of the world nowadays. But it's the way that we're moving at the moment, and in our current project here at Riddle's Court. The funding pie chart is almost the same as Greenlaw. It's just £5.6 million and not 1.8. And we've already spent £700,000 getting where we are today. So the funding climate that we're in at the moment is different and interesting, and say every project is different and every project throws up different challenges. Riddle's Court we're going to restore as the Patrick Geddes Centre for Learning. Now it's not the big idea, now sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, it's the big idea. The reason why we're creating Riddle's Court as a Centre for Learning, we became involved in 2008 in Riddle's Court when the owner, the City of Edinburgh Council, tried to place the building on the market and nobody wanted it. And those who knew Riddle's Court, there was an outcry, and those who knew it found their way to us, and we said, can we help? And the council asked us to come along and help to see whether we could find a future for this building. We did an options appraisal. We looked at all options for this building. The best option that we came up with was as a centre for learning. And the reason for that is Riddle's Court has been in educational use since the 1890s when Patrick Geddes acquired it. The 1890s in Edinburgh, most people of wealth had moved to the new town, and the old town was becoming derelict and redundant. And Patrick Geddes stepped in as a pioneering developer to restore buildings, to conserve them, to give them new uses. So 150 years down the line, we are doing the same thing. But it had been an educational use, and we felt that that was the best use to take forward. And the use is just as important as it being a Category A listed building. And you'll see when Audrey shows you the slides, it is quite an important building. You're probably in the version. But again, we came on board when the council couldn't sort out the building. Unusually for us in this case, the council was extremely helpful at the start. Not been so helpful in the last wee while, which has caused us lots of problems. But again, it has made us realise that you need the support of your local council at all levels. Again, because of the funding, the complexity of the funding of Riddle's Court, we have a fairly big funding strategy, and we also have an action plan, and we methodically go through our fundraising strategy and action plan to try and get to the end with all the money being in place. Where we start is with the key funders. We always start with easy ones, which at the moment is Historic Scotland, because we have a Category A listed building. We're taking it off the buildings at risk register, we're giving it a new life, ideal for them. And we usually aim for the highest level of funding, and if we can squeeze a bit more, we do, but we have to be realistic that everybody's calling for the money. Once that's funding secured, we then move on, and the Heritage Lottery is our next key funder, again, depending on the project. We've got both Historic Scotland and the Heritage Lottery for Riddle's Court. Historic Scotland's funding contribution is at 12% of the total project cost. Very small amount of money, but it's an important bit of funding because it primes the funding. The lottery came on board quite quickly and said, this is a great project, we love it because it's a building off the buildings at risk register and it's a centre for learning. So we tick all of their boxes. And we've just recently had our round 2 pass and they've upped their funding. So the right building, the right project, the money will come. We then move on to our next tier of funding, which is the charitable trusts and foundations. And we go methodically through them to get to a point. We're now in our final stages of fundraising for Riddles Court. We've got £5 million on the table now, just over £5 million. We're on the last bit of funding, and we're now turning towards our philanthropic and public appeal to raise money. But interestingly for us, for Riddles Court, we're also occupying the building. We moved in here 2 years ago, so we've been able to develop the project from living within the building. It's an unusual building because it isn't derelict, it is redundant, and as you can see from the scaffolding outside, it's falling to bits, and bits fall off quite regularly. And the heating's now packed up, which is, it's quite nice today, but the heating, you know, it's falling to bits, but it's not derelict. It still has a roof that just about retains the water. But we've developed the project from within. We've taken a loss-making building from the City of Edinburgh Council and we've turned it around and we've brought it into surplus. Now that's taken 2 years of hard work on our part by hosting events, by encouraging people to book the building for meetings. We've had a couple of weddings. We've been part of the festival. We were just recently part of the Science Festival this year. We had a Lego exhibition for 2 weeks. We had over 9,000 people through the door in 2 weeks. Now, that was a fantastic achievement. We made a surplus on it, but we got 9,000 people through this door that would never have come to this building. So in terms of promoting the project, it was a double whammy. And we're now at the stage that you know, it's a free-for-all now because we've got this last bit of funding and we will use that to get money from anybody who's prepared to walk through the door and listen to us. So you'll see over there's a little leaflet on the project. There's a nice donation box next to it. If you have some spare change, you can put it into the donation box. If you want to put some paper in, we've got little gift aid envelopes. So if you feel this is a building, once you've seen it later on, it's worth saving, do help us. I think in conclusion, I hope I've shown you from just the projects I've explained that BPTs, and some of you are a BPT, are a key player in saving buildings at risk, but also hopefully giving you some inspiration as to different ways of actually making that funding strategy and package stack up. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy for buildings, and because all projects are different, and to a certain extent they do need a unique strategy for each and every building to achieve the end uses that you can see here. We've had to continually evolve our fundraising activities over the years to meet with whatever political landscape that we've ended up in. And we will continually have to evolve over time. And funders' priorities change, and we have to evolve to meet these funders' priorities and for future fundraising strategies. You know, a few examples. Historic Scotland, they should be there for the near future, and they are an important player in the funding for historic buildings. But as you can see from our side, their percentage is getting less. So you have to find the money from elsewhere. And our projects are getting bigger. We're doing a 10 million one in Aberdeen at the moment. The pie chart looks the same. It's just, you know, it's just another building with another end use that we have to try and tease out for that. The Heritage Lottery Fund, again, are a key player. The Heritage Grant Scheme is perfect for the right project and the right end use. And it's the end use that's important for the Heritage Lottery. Greenlaw didn't get Heritage Lottery funding at the end of the day because we didn't have the right end use. Some of our projects have fallen by the wayside because without the Heritage Lottery, they just didn't stack up. But the Lottery Enterprise Grant, the new scheme that came out last year, could be a fantastic opportunity for fundraising for the future because it takes away all of the activity development you've got to deliver during the delivery phase that the lottery insists on. So for some projects, and our Aberdeen project, which is very much a commercial end use, it's perfect for. We've also had European funding, but that's drying up. And again, with charitable trusts and foundations, there's still money out there, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to secure, and the grants are becoming smaller. And I think one thing we've noticed over the last year is any charitable trust that has a UK-wide remit ask what's happening after September and their involvement in it. So that's certainly one for the future. Philanthropic and public donations, absolutely, again, the demand will get higher, but you have to constantly evolve to allow people to give money to you in the way they want to give money to you. We can't just say, give me a cheque. So we're now doing things like community shares, crowdsourcing, we've got friends groups trying to raise money. We already do fundraising events, tourist talks, and such like. But it's all part of the package, and it's that complexity of the package that will deliver projects in the future. So that's what we've done in the past. we're moving in the future. Thank you for listening to me. We're happy to chat further in the workshop, but hopefully that'll just give you a bit of an idea as to different ways to fund your projects.